problems.
Yeah.
We all face them, right? Big ones, small ones that kind of keep you up at night, or, just those annoying little speed bumps.
Yeah, and we often just want them gone, out of the way.
But what if, instead of just seeing them as obstacles, we started seeing problems more as opportunities? Maybe chances to learn, sharpen our focus, even innovate.
That shift in perspective is really key, and it's exactly where problem solving and critical thinking come into play. They aren't just like academic buzzwords. They're really essential skills for navigating all the complexities you run into, at work and just in life generally.
Which is precisely why we're doing this deep dive today. We've gathered a whole stack of sources, research papers, articles, even some internal notes, all focused on understanding how we actually tackle problems and, crucially, how we can get better at thinking critically about them.
Yeah, our mission here is to sift through all that, pull out the most important insights, the processes, maybe some surprising techniques, the common pitfalls, and give you practical ways you can start sharpening these vital skills right away.
Okay, so let's jump right in. At the most basic level, what are we talking about when we say problem solving?
Well, think of problem solving as a kind of journey, right? With a clear goal. Moving from recognizing there's a challenge to actually putting a solution in place. The sources often describe it as a structured framework, usually broken down into steps.
How many steps are we talking?
It varies. Sometimes you see 4, sometimes maybe 7. Focusing on a slightly longer framework, like a 7-step one, can be useful, though. It helps make each stage really clear and explicit.
Okay, so it's a process, a kind of roadmap. Where does critical thinking fit onto that map then?
Well, critical thinking isn't just one stop on the map. It's more like the engine driving the whole journey. It's about actively, skillfully analyzing information, questioning assumptions, especially your own, and carefully evaluating all the different options.
So it's not just about finding the answer, but really understanding the question itself and weighing the different paths to get there.
Exactly. There's a meta-analysis study mentioned in the sources that makes this point really well. It showed a significant positive link between critical thinking skills and how effective someone is at solving problems.
Interesting.
Yeah, and critical thinking is needed right from the get-go, making sure you've even defined the problem correctly, all the way through generating ideas, assessing potential solutions, and even checking how well the solution you picked actually worked out. It underpins every single step.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the thoughtful analysis layer on top of the procedural steps. Okay, so when we talk about how people or teams actually approach problems, are there standard ways, or is it more of a free-for-all?
There are definitely different approaches. You can lean into those more structured processes we just mentioned, that sort of step-by-step framework.
Right.
The sources also mention techniques that are useful in specific situations, like what happened, so what, now what. Yeah. It sounds simple, but it's a structured way for people to process something they've experienced together, figure out what it means, and then plan what to do next. It's not just random navel-gazing. It helps you move from reflection to action without getting stuck.
I like that. Simple but intentional. What about those problems that aren't so neat and tidy? The really messy, ambiguous ones.
Yeah. For those, a different kind of approach often works better, something like design thinking. The sources describe this as a specific, very human-centered methodology. It's particularly good for tackling those ill-defined or complex problems.
Human-centered. What's the key idea there?
It means you start by looking at the problem from the perspective of the person experiencing it, not just from a business or technical angle. The sources have a great example.
Yeah, okay.
Instead of a food company saying, we need to sell more product X to teens, a human-centered approach might frame it as, teenage girls need easy ways to eat nutritious food so they can be healthy and thrive. See the difference? The focus shifts completely to the user's actual need.
That's a huge shift. It must change the kinds of solutions you'd even think about.
Totally. And design thinking usually involves stages like empathize understanding the user, define framing that human-centered problem, then ideate brainstorming solutions, prototype making ideas tangible, and test getting feedback.
And it's not strictly linear, right?
Not at all. That's a key insight. It's iterative. Testing almost always gives you new insights that send you back, maybe to refine the problem definition or even brainstorm completely new ideas. It's a loop of learning and improving.
So we've got structured methods, human-centered processes like design thinking. Are there also different, modes of thinking we can use.
Absolutely. The sources make a distinction between linear thinking and lateral thinking. Linear thinking is kind of our default mode, sequential, logical, following a straight path, relying on data. It's essential for lots of problems.
And lateral thinking is the opposite.
Pretty much, yeah. It's nonlinear. It's about deliberately breaking established patterns, challenging assumptions, looking at things from weird angles sometimes. It's described as a type of divergent thinking, crucial for brainstorming and coming up with genuinely new, innovative ideas.
That out-of-the-box stuff.
Exactly that. The insight is that the best solution might be completely outside your normal line of thought. And there are tools to help, like Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hacks.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Right, where you deliberately look at a problem from different perspectives, just the facts, just the feelings, just the risks, just the benefits, and so on. Or another one is SCAMPER.
Scamper.
Yeah, it's an acronym: substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, reverse. It gives you questions to ask about something that already exists to force you to think differently and spark new ideas. These tools kind of provide structure for being unstructured in your thinking, if that makes sense.
It does, a structured way to be creative. But, even with all these methods, our brains can still trip us up, can't they?
Oh, they really can. One of the biggest barriers the sources talk about is cognitive biases. These are like systematic patterns in our thinking that lead us away from purely rational judgment. Often they're unconscious shortcuts, maybe influenced by emotions or social stuff.
And everyone has them?
Pretty much everyone. The key thing is they can seriously impair how clearly we see a problem and how objectively we evaluate solutions.
Can you give us some examples from the sources, ones that really show how they work?
Sure. A really common one is hindsight bias. The "I knew it all along" feeling.
Oh, yes. I totally saw that coming.
Exactly, even when you really didn't. After something happens, we tend to overestimate how predictable it seemed before it happened. The sources mention classic research, like a study about predicting Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court confirmation.
What did they find?
Well, before the vote, about 58% of students predicted he'd be confirmed. But after he was confirmed, 78% claimed they had predicted yes. That jump. That's hindsight bias. And the danger is, it makes us overconfident about predicting future events, maybe leading us to take unwise risks because we think we'll see it coming next time too.
That's a tricky one. What else?
There's anchoring bias. This is where we rely way too heavily on the first piece of information we get the anchor when making decisions.
Like the first price someone names in a negotiation.
Exactly that. Or think about a doctor. Their first impression of a patient's symptoms might anchor their thinking, making it harder to consider other possible diagnoses later on, which can be really, really problematic.
Definitely.
Then there's functional fixedness. This is a mental block where we can only see an object being used for its most common intended purpose.
Like only seeing a hammer as something to hit nails with.
Precisely. The sources use examples like needing to squash a bug but only having, say, a can of air freshener nearby. Your brain might fixate on its freshening function, and you start looking for a fly swatter, totally missing that the can itself could do the job. It's a specific type of what's called a mental set, just reusing old solutions even when they don't quite fit.
That feels very relatable. And confirmation bias is another big one, right? We hear about that a lot.
Yes, and it's incredibly powerful. It's our tendency to actively look for, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while kind of ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts our beliefs.
So you basically filter reality to fit your existing view.
You got it. Which makes objective problem solving super difficult because you're not seeing the whole picture. The sources also briefly touch on others, like the misinformation effect, where hearing stuff after an event can actually change your memory of the event itself.
Very.
Yeah. And actor-observer bias, blaming our own mistakes on the situation. Traffic made me late. But others' mistakes on their character, they're just unreliable. And self-serving bias, taking credit for success, but blaming failure on outside forces.
It really feels like our own minds are sometimes the biggest hurdle to overcome.
They definitely need careful management. Another interesting barrier mentioned is our tendency to overlook subtractive changes. When we try to fix something, our default is often to add something, add a feature, add a rule, add more lanes to a highway.
Instead of taking something away.
Exactly. We're less likely to think about solving a problem by removing something, simplifying, or streamlining. The sources suggest that information overload can even make this worse. We grasp for more complexity instead of less.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got a handle on what these skills are, how they interact, different ways to approach problems, and the mental traps. The big question now is, how do we actually get better at all this?
Well, the sources offer some really practical strategies. A huge one for fighting biases is deliberately seeking out diverse perspectives.
Talking to people who think differently.
Yes. People with different backgrounds, roles, opinions. It forces you to confront assumptions you didn't even know you had. It directly challenges things like confirmation bias and functional fixedness. Getting the right people in the room, as one source puts it, isn't just nice, it's fundamental.
Makes sense. What else?
Taking time to reflect on your own thinking process is key. Just pausing to ask yourself, why am I leaning this way? Or where did I get this information? Can help you spot your own biases.
A bit of metacognition.
Exactly. And to tackle hindsight bias, try consciously thinking about alternative ways things could have turned out before you make a decision. It helps you appreciate the uncertainty involved.
Good tip. Any broader advice for the problem-solving process itself?
Yeah, lots of practical stuff. Always make sure you clearly define the problem first. Sounds obvious, but it's easy to skip. Resist that urge to jump straight to solutions.
Be patient.
Right. Be willing to try different approaches if the first one stalls. Flexibility is key. Oh, and try not to take it personally. Focus on the problem, not on blame. Creating a psychologically safe space is also vital, so people feel okay sharing ideas, even weird ones.
That encourages diverse thinking, too.
Absolutely. And maybe the less glamorous part, but for complex issues, document things. The problem, the info you gathered, the ideas you considered, why you made certain decisions, it helps keep things clear.
It's interesting, the sources even suggest problem-solving can happen unconsciously.
Yeah, there are mentions of unconscious processing leading to breakthroughs, sometimes even in dreams. They cite examples like Elias Howe supposedly dreaming about the needle design for the sewing machine, or Kekulé dreaming of a snake biting its tail, which led to the structure of benzene.
Solving problems while asleep. I like the sound of that.
Yeah. And we shouldn't forget the power of working together. Collaborative problem solving, tapping into collective intelligence, these are highlighted as really powerful, especially for big, messy, real-world problems where you need lots of different perspectives and expertise.
So how does all this theory translate into our everyday lives?
Yeah.
Where do we actually use these skills?
Oh, everywhere. But particularly at work, take workplace ethics. Facing an ethical dilemma is a type of problem, right?
Definitely a tough one.
The sources suggest a structured four-step approach using these skills. 1, define the ethical problem clearly. 2, list all the relevant facts. 3, list possible solutions and think about their impact on everyone involved. 4, decide on the best action plan based on that analysis. It gives you a framework for those difficult situations.
That sounds incredibly useful.
Another really powerful area is understanding how our perception shapes everything. There's a great example in the sources with two fathers, Bob and John.
Okay.
They both see the same thing. Their daughter isn't getting much playing time in basketball, even though she practices hard, same event. But their perception creates totally different problems and reactions.
How so?
Bob perceives it as unfairness, thinks the coach is biased and gets angry. His problem is the coach is unfair. John, however, perceives that the coach values team performance, feels proud of his daughter's effort regardless, and defines the problem as, how can my daughter improve her skills to earn more time?
Wow. So the exact same situation leads to completely different problems just based on how they perceive it.
Exactly. Perception, which is heavily influenced by our biases and assumptions, is critical in how we even identify what the problem is in the first place. And of course, these skills are massively valued when you're looking for a job.
Right, those behavioral interview questions.
Yep. Tell me about a time when questions are designed to see how you apply problem solving and critical thinking.
So how should you answer those?
A really good technique mentioned is STAR. Situation, task, action, result.
STAR.
Yeah. Describe the situation or task, explain the actions you took, highlighting your problem-solving and thinking skills, and then describe the positive result. It gives a clear, structured story that shows your abilities in action.
Situation, task, action, result. That's super practical advice for interviews or, honestly, just for thinking about your own achievements.
It really is. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're fundamental tools for handling challenges, making better choices, and just generally navigating the world more effectively.
So we've journeyed through understanding what problem-solving and critical thinking really are. Looked at different approaches, structured, human-centered, creative lateral thinking. We've shown a light on those sneaky cognitive biases.
The ones that trip us up.
Exactly. And we looked at concrete strategies to get better, seeking diverse views, reflection, documenting things. And we saw how it all plays out in the real world: ethics, perception, job interviews.
And the clear message from all these sources is that these are skills you can learn and improve. It's not about being born a problem solver. It's about understanding the process and practicing the techniques.
Absolutely. So now that you've done this deep dive with us, maybe think about this. What's one problem you're facing right now that you could look at a bit differently using these ideas? Or maybe what's one new strategy, like seeking out a totally different perspective or trying a scamper question that you could experiment with today?
You know that feeling? You've got a tricky problem or a big decision, and your brain just latches onto the first idea, or maybe the easiest one.
Oh, absolutely. Or you're in a brainstorming session trying to get new ideas flowing, and somehow everyone just keeps circling back to the same few concepts.
Exactly. It feels like your brain's being efficient, and I guess, in a way, it is.
It is. But these mental shortcuts, heuristics or cognitive biases, they evolved over, well, hundreds of thousands of years for survival in a world that looks very different from today.
Right. Think, hunter-gatherer mode. Spot danger, react instantly. Great for avoiding, say, a saber-toothed cat.
Definitely.
Not always the best approach for, designing a new software feature or working through complex business data in, the modern world.
No, not quite.
Yeah.
Our sources really emphasize this point. These shortcuts, while fantastic for keeping the species going, can actually work against us now. They can limit our creative thinking, make us miss important details, or even lead us to solve the wrong problem entirely.
Or just keep making the same mistakes, right? Because we're stuck in those mental grooves.
Precisely. One source puts it really bluntly, something like, most of the decisions we believe we're making with a clear mind are actually controlled by mental shortcuts known as cognitive biases.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just occasional slips, it's kind of the default setting.
It often is. And they mention there are sort of two broad types: biases related to how we process information, and others driven more by our emotions.
Okay, so our brains aren't always optimized for the kind of, deep thinking and innovation we often need today. Let's dive into some specific biases. How do these actually show up when we're trying to tackle problems, maybe in a team?
Well, a really common one is confirmation bias. This is basically our tendency to look for and favor information that confirms what we already believe.
Ah, right. So if I think solution A is the best.
You'll subconsciously look for evidence that supports solution A and maybe downplay or ignore evidence that points towards solution B or C. It makes challenging your own assumptions really difficult.
Yeah, I can see how that would shut down creativity fast. You're not asking what's the best way. You're asking how can I prove my way is best.
Exactly. And another huge one is anchoring bias. This is where we get fixated on the very first piece of information we hear, the anchor.
Even if it's totally random.
Sometimes, yeah. Or just the first estimate, the first idea thrown out. That initial anchor heavily influences everything that follows. All the subsequent judgments and discussions kind of revolve around it.
Oh, I've seen that happen. Someone throws out a number or an idea early on, and suddenly the whole conversation is stuck orbiting that point, even if it wasn't, a great starting point.
It really narrows the field. And these biases, they don't just affect individuals, they can get amplified in group settings.
That's so.
Well, you have things like the availability heuristic. If an example is easy to remember, maybe because it was recent or dramatic, we tend to think it's more common or important than it really is.
So, one bad customer experience sticks in everyone's mind and skews the whole discussion.
Exactly. Or framing bias, just how you present a problem, can completely change the kinds of solutions people come up with. You might miss the real issue because of the initial framing.
Okay. And you mentioned another one.
The illusion of explanatory depth. That's a fascinating one. It's where we think we understand something complex, like how a zipper works, or a political issue much better than we actually do.
Until someone asks you to explain it step by step.
Precisely. And that leads to overconfidence, maybe poor planning, when tackling problems related to that thing we think we understand deeply.
And it's crucial to remember, right, this isn't about being smart or not smart. Our sources say everyone's affected: experts, beginners, groups, individuals.
Yes, absolutely. It's baked into our cognitive wiring. We can't just switch it off.
Okay, so if our brains are kind of naturally wired with these potential pitfalls for complex thinking, what do we do? How do we fight back, intellectually speaking?
Well, this is where critical thinking comes in. It's sort of the essential countermeasure.
Critical thinking? Okay, but that doesn't just mean being negative or finding fault, does it?
Not at all, no. It's more about disciplined thinking. One source defines it as the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information. Basically, using rigorous thought as a guide to what you believe and do.
That sounds like work, not automatic.
It absolutely is work. It's not our default mode.
Yeah.
It takes conscious effort, practice, and a good deal of self-awareness.
Yeah.
You need to think about how you're thinking to catch those biases and errors. It's a skill.
And it has deep roots, right? Back to Socrates and his questioning methods.
Exactly. Challenging assumptions, probing for clarity, demanding evidence. That's the core of it. It's about unbiased analysis, rational evaluation, forming judgments based on reason and evidence, not just intuition or bias.
So critical thinking helps us take apart problems and ideas more objectively.
Yes. While it's useful for evaluating any information, it's absolutely vital for improving how we approach problem solving and decision making. It gives us the tools to challenge those sneaky assumptions that biases introduce.
Okay, so critical thinking provides the analytical rigor. But what about generating new ideas? Moving from analysis to, well, creation. Are there ways to structure that process to help us bypass some of these biases, especially when working together?
Yes, definitely. Methodologies like creative problem-solving CPS are designed for exactly that. CPS is a structured way for individuals or groups to come up with novel and useful solutions.
Novel and useful, both important.
Crucial, and it operates on a couple of core beliefs. One, that everyone actually is creative in some way, and two, that these creative skills aren't fixed. They can be learned and improved.
That's encouraging. It's not just for the creative types.
Not at all. The engine driving CPS is this deliberate balancing act between two kinds of thinking: divergent thinking and convergent thinking.
Okay, what's the difference?
Divergent thinking is about going wide, generating lots of options, exploring possibilities, making lists. Think quantity over quality initially. Convergent thinking is the opposite. It's about narrowing down, evaluating, selecting the best options, making choices.
So expand, then focus. Expand, then focus.
Exactly. You cycle between the two. CPS typically breaks this down into four main stages. Stage one is clarification.
Getting clear on the problem first.
Absolutely critical and often rushed. This involves really digging into the challenge, gathering information, understanding the context, and defining the real problem you need to solve, not just the surface symptom.
How do you do that effectively?
Our sources suggest things like using specific question stems like "how might we?" or "in what ways might we?" to frame the challenge. It forces you to articulate it as an opportunity for solutions. The big danger here, as one source puts it, is coming up with a brilliant answer to the wrong question.
Right. All that effort wasted because you don't clarify the actual problem up front.
Precisely. You need to explore the vision, collect data, really nail down that challenge statement. Once you have that clarity, you move to stage two, ideation.
The brainstorming part?
Sort of, but maybe more structured.
Yeah.
This is where you generate tons of ideas related to the clarified challenge. And the absolute golden rule here, specifically to fight biases like judging too soon.
Let me guess. Defer judgment.
You got it. No idea is good or bad at this stage. You want volume. Encourage wild ideas, build on others' ideas, make unusual connections, take some mental risks. Quantity is key. Don't filter yet.
That sounds hard. Our brains want to categorize and judge immediately.
It is hard. It takes discipline. But once you have that big, raw list of ideas, you shift gears into stage three, development.
Okay, now we start filtering.
Not just filtering, but strengthening. You take the most promising or intriguing ideas from the ideation phase and start building them out. You look at the pluses, the potential, but also crucially, the concerns or obstacles.
And instead of letting the concerns kill the idea,
You frame them as problems to be solved. How might we overcome this drawback? How can we enhance this aspect? Tools like PPCO pluses, potentials, concerns, and how to overcome the concerns help structure this evaluation and refinement process.
so you're improving ideas, not just picking winners and losers right away.
Exactly. You're developing them into more robust potential solutions. And then finally, you reach stage four, implementation.
Making it happen.
Turning the refined solution into an actual plan. Who does what by when? What are the steps? What resources are needed? Tools like posted action planning can help map this out clearly. But for any of this to work, the environment is key. People need to feel safe sharing ideas, even weird ones, and be willing to take those intellectual risks.
That makes sense. So CPS is one structured approach. Are there others for different kinds of challenges?
Oh, yes. Design thinking is another really influential one. It's particularly good for complex problems where the human element is central, and maybe the problem itself isn't even clearly defined at the start.
Problems where you kind of have to discover the problem as you go.
Exactly. It's very iterative. It usually starts with empathize really deeply understanding the needs, experiences, and worldview of the people you're designing for. Setting aside your own assumptions is critical here.
That sounds like a direct counter to bias, focusing on the user, not your own preconceived notions.
It absolutely is. Then you define the problem based on those user insights, framing it in a human-centered way. Then you ideate, generating solutions, similar to CPS. Then you prototype, build rough versions of potential solutions. And finally, you test those prototypes with actual users.
And that testing probably sends you back, right?
Often, yes. Testing gives you feedback, new insights, which might lead you to redefine the problem or go back to ideation or refine the prototype. It's a cycle, and empathy runs through the whole thing.
Okay, so CPS and design thinking offer structured processes. What about just thinking differently? I've heard about lateral thinking.
Ah, yes, Edward de Bono's concept. Lateral thinking is quite different. It's not so much a step-by-step process like CPS or design thinking. It's more a set of tools and a mindset for breaking out of traditional logical step-by-step thinking patterns.
So linear thinking goes A to B to C, lateral thinking tries to jump sideways.
Kind of, yeah. Linear thinking follows the most obvious path. Lateral thinking actively challenges the assumptions that define that path. It looks for completely different angles, alternative ways to even perceive the problem. It's about disrupting conventional thinking.
How do you do that? It sounds a bit abstract.
Well, there are specific techniques. Things like systematically challenging the core assumptions everyone takes for granted about the problem, actively seeking out alternative ways to phrase or view the situation, using random entry, like picking a random word from the dictionary and forcing connections to your problem to spark new ideas.
That sounds wild.
It can be. Or using provocation, deliberately introducing an extreme, impossible, or contradictory statement related to the problem, like car should have square wheels, and then using that provocation as a stepping stone to generate genuinely new ideas by examining the consequences or principles behind the provocation.
So it's about shaking up your perspective deliberately.
Exactly. Trying to escape the mental tramlines that biases and habit often keep us on.
Okay, so we have these overarching methodologies, CPS, design thinking, and then this different angle with lateral thinking. And within these, there are specific tools.
Yes, and our sources mention quite a few practical tools that support these processes. We already touched on PPCO for development and post-it methods for ideation and planning.
Right.
But even simple things, like consistently posing problems as questions during the clarification stage, just framing things as how might we or what if, keeps possibilities open.
And you mentioned webbing, or the ladder of abstraction, earlier.
Yeah, that's a great tool for clarification too. It helps you move up and down between very specific instances of a problem. Why did this one customer complain? And broader, more abstract levels. What are the systemic issues in our customer service? Helps you find the right altitude to define the challenge.
Makes sense. And brainwriting as opposed to just brainstorming out loud.
Yes, brainwriting, where people write ideas down silently first before sharing, can be really good for ideation. It helps quieter people contribute equally and can reduce the influence of anchoring or loud voices dominating. Visual connections is another tool sometimes used in ideation or development, forcing links between unrelated images or concepts to spark creativity.
So these aren't just random activities. They're techniques designed to structure thinking and collaboration in ways that hopefully mitigate some of those biases we talked about.
Precisely. They provide guardrails and prompts to guide our thinking in more productive and less biased directions, whether we're fixing something small or aiming for a big innovation.
Okay, let's try to pull this together. Biases are essentially built-in features of our thinking. We can't just eliminate them.
No, they're instinctive, deeply wired. But the key takeaway is that we can minimize their negative impact.
How? By being aware of them.
Awareness is the first step, understanding when they're likely to kick in. Then, actively applying critical thinking to question assumptions and evaluate evidence objectively.
And using structured methods.
Exactly. Using frameworks like CPS or design thinking provides a roadmap, especially in groups, that has bias-countering principles built into the stages like deferring judgment or focusing on empathy.
And practicing things like divergent thinking or lateral thinking techniques helps us break out of those comfortable, potentially bias-influenced ruts.
Yes, it all requires conscious effort, deliberate practice, And importantly, being open to outside perspectives. Getting feedback from others is one of the best ways to spot your own blind spots.
So this whole deep dive, pulling together insights from different sources on biases, critical thinking, and these problem-solving approaches, it's really about giving you, the listener, a kind of toolkit, right?
Yeah, a shortcut to being better informed about how your own mind works and how you can work with it, or sometimes around its defaults, to think more clearly and creatively.
Providing those practical insights, those aha moments about why we get stuck sometimes, and offering concrete ways to approach challenges differently without you having to wade through all the academic papers yourself.
Absolutely, because whether it's a big strategic decision at work, a personal dilemma, or trying to come up with the next great idea with your team, understanding these dynamics, the biases, the countermeasures, it's just incredibly valuable. It's becoming less of a nice to have and more of a need to have skill.
Okay, so to recap, we've seen how our evolutionary brain wiring, those efficient shortcuts, can sometimes trip us up in our complex modern world.
Right. And we've explored how critical thinking gives us the analytical lens to challenge that wiring and evaluate things more objectively.
And then we looked at structured methodologies like creative problem solving and design thinking as frameworks to guide us through generating and refining ideas more effectively, hopefully steering us past common biases.
Plus, specific tools and techniques, and the mindset shift of lateral thinking to help us break free from conventional paths.
So here's something to think about. How many problems that we see around us, maybe in our workplaces, our communities, maybe even bigger societal issues, might be tackled differently, perhaps more effectively, if we were all just a bit more aware of our cognitive biases.
And more skilled in deliberately applying some of this structured, critical, and creative thinking.
How might your next important decision or your team's next big creative challenge change knowing what we've discussed today?